The plan looked simple the way plans always do when they're drawn on a kitchen table. Daniel Reed spread two maps over the wood, one paper topo with contour lines squeezed tight like ribs, and one laminated aviation chart the color of old bone. He traced a finger up from Fairbanks, over the Yukon River, and into the teeth of the Brooks Range. Marie, stirring sugar into the kids' cocoa, leaned to see the route. A gravel bar on the Hula Hula River for the drop, a slow, looping walk through willow and tussock and dwarf birch, a shoulder of shale to gain a view, then 10 days of moving camp until the pilot came back to lift them out. A rite of passage, Daniel called it. One last summer before their daughter and son hit the ages where the world starts to pull in directions parents can't predict. They were the kind of family that made neighbors think, not for the first time, that some people were built for the country and some for the city. Daniel, 42, had served as a seasonal ranger when he was young, the kind of man who could read weather in the angle of a cloud and time in a river's speed. He'd worked the last decade as a refrigeration tech, a skill that paid better than romance, but he kept the old knowledge polished. Map and compass, knots, the way to make a fire when the rain insists you won't. Marie, 39, was a photographer who loved wilderness the way a listener loves a symphony, attentive, patient, ready to be surprised. Her black and white prints of smoke on snow, moose in river fog, and children's boots drying by a Yukon stove hung in small galleries around Fairbanks. Their daughter Sophie, 11, kept a notebook where she drew small, exact pictures of birds and wrote their names in neat letters. Jacob, 8, carried a pocket full of smooth stones and had a talent for asking the one question you can't answer immediately. It was July of 2001, the air in town smelling like sun on pine. Daniel had worked up the route for months, marked water sources and potential windbreaks, measured daily mileage against the strength of a child's stride and a storm's temper. "We'll be out before the berries ripen," he told Marie, which in Alaska is the same as writing a date on a calendar. She smiled and loaded film into her cameras. The kids packed the journals she had bought them for the trip. On the first page of his, Jacob wrote, in pencil that smudged like fog, "We're going where maps get quiet. Bush planes are the buses of Alaska." The Reed family met theirs at a small airstrip outside Fairbanks, a single-engine de Havilland with a pilot named Kurt who smelled faintly of motor oil and cinnamon gum. Daniel liked him immediately because Kurt didn't oversell his confidence. He checked loads twice, tightened straps himself, tapped his altimeter as if reminding it of their agreement. "Weather's fair but fickle," he said, which is the Arctic's mottos transposed into a human voice. Daniel rode shotgun, kids in gear and back, Marie by the window with her camera, though she told herself she'd save the film for the peaks. The plane lifted, the runway slid away, the world opened, black spruce giving to lighter tundra, rivers crossing the land like loops of silver cord thrown careless across a green tablecloth. Sophie pressed her forehead to the window, a small O of awe in her mouth. Jacob asked if the clouds had names out here, or if they were all just cloud. Kurt chuckled and dipped the wing so they could see the line of the Brooks shouldering into view. From above, the place looked clean and almost soft, like a bedsheet folded on a line. No roads, no poles, nothing that suggested the math of a city. It is easy to love a place when you look down on it from a warm seat. They landed on a gravel bar baked dry by a week of sun. The plane rolled to a stop, settled like a dog. Daniel and Kurt unloaded the gear. Tent, sleeping bags, a stove and white gas, tarps, axes, the bare canisters, the food sacks divided by day because order out there was more than a nicety. Marie took one photograph of the kids with the plane behind them, then capped her lens. "Save it," she said. "We'll want the first night on film." Kurt looked at the sky like a man checking a watch. 12th of July, he told Daniel. "I'll be back for you the 22nd. Same bar, late afternoon. If I'm not here that day, weather's got me. If I'm not here the next, the weather still has me. On the 3rd, that's when you get to be mad." They shook hands the way men do when they use the word "see" to mean if. The plane turned. The propeller made a curtain of air, and then the family stood alone in a place that was so quiet Marie could hear the river's small talk with the stones. They moved like a neat paragraph for the first 3 days, each person's pace tucked inside the other's. Daniel taught the kids how to read caribou tracks and how to test muskeg with a trekking pole. Marie taught them how to notice a thing fully before they named it. They camped in a curve of willows where the river's sound made a soft wall between them and sleep. At night, Sophie read aloud from a book that had stayed overnight in too many packs and smelled like old rain. Jacob counted the seconds between wind gusts and decided the weather had a heartbeat. Daniel scribbled mileages and bearings on a coil-bound notebook, checked the barometer on his watch, and listened to the low talk of cloud. On the 4th day, they climbed a shale shoulder to see the valley open. Marie set the tripod and made the quiet series of small adjustments that turn a scene into a photograph. The kids threw flat stones toward the horizon, believing distance could be measured in skips. Daniel studied the run of the ridge to the north. We can cut a day if the weather holds, he said, which is a sentence the weather loves as a challenge. That night, the wind fell flat. The mosquitoes thickened, then vanished the way they do before a change. On the fifth day, the sky slid gray without a seam. In the morning, Marie photographed the kind of even light she told her students was a gift. By noon, the air felt heavy with something that wasn't rain and wasn't yet wind. By evening, the wind had decided what it wanted and took it. First the tent's easy flap, then the stove's steady flame, then the kids' attention. Daniel pitched a second tarp as a windbreak, checked the guy lines, told himself out loud the way good leaders do that everything was fine because he believed it could be. He slept badly, which in the backcountry still means he slept more than he would have in town thinking about not sleeping. On the sixth morning, the weather did what weather does in places where history has long been a stone ledger and not a human one. It made its own plan. The sky darkened and dropped low, not with rain, but with something colder. A front slid down from the high country like a hand across a table. They felt it before they saw it. Air thin and sharp, wind that cut the sound out of speech. Snow in July is not a trick in the brooks. It is a kind of punctuation. By afternoon, they were inside their tent listening to pellets of sleet click like nails on the fabric. Daniel anchored the corners with stones as big as his anger at himself. Marie heated soup and watched the kids' faces, that beautiful and terrible act all parents know, measuring fear and deciding how much to admit. When the storm eased, just a little, just enough to make the sound of their own thoughts audible, Daniel told Marie they'd wait a day, then decide. She nodded. Sophie drew a raven in her notebook with strokes that were too quick because cold is its own boss. Jacob asked if the pilot could find them if the sky had gone missing. He will, Daniel said, because children deserve a sentence with a period at the end when the world turns to commas. 2 more days of weather. And then a day that looked like a different season, clean and blue and light over everything. They tried to make up miles and made up none. The ground had gone slick. The river was fast with new water. In the distance, something moved that was either a bear or a moose, and either way they gave it the space it deserved. They camped on a higher bench and counted how much fuel they had and how many days remained, and Daniel wrote a sum that made him swallow. We shift to driftwood fires for cooking, he told Marie. Save gas for emergencies. He saw her glance at the kids and knew there would be no other kind. On July 20th, the day that meant start expecting a plane tomorrow, they reached a gravel bar they thought was the one. It had the right turn in the river's elbow, the right scatter of stones, the right view of a notch in the hills. They stacked driftwood in a ready pile for smoke. Marie took one photograph, just one, of the kids sitting on a log, their cheeks windburned, their eyes older than they had been when they started. Daniel listened to the sky with an old ranger's attention. The air above him said not yet. On the 22nd, the sound of a small engine reached them and then slid away, like a word you nearly recall and lose. They burned driftwood and then the paper map because smoke is a language pilots can read. If the plane saw them, it did not say so. If it tried to land elsewhere, they never learned where. On the 23rd, the weather closed again, a lid on a pot, a hand over a mouth. Daniel bit the soft wood of his pencil in two. The search began in Fairbanks 3 days later when Daniel's brother called the troopers. A plane might be late by weather. A pilot might be smart and stay on the ground. A promise might stretch a day, but at some point a number becomes a siren. Helicopters ran the grid, pilots speaking a liturgy of coordinates into radios that only paid back static. Volunteers in old planes flew the lines they knew from decades of doing this. Because in Alaska, many people carry a map of other people's luck in their heads. On a gravel bar miles from the Reed's ideal route, a crew found a shredded domed tent half buried in silt. The poles snapped like ribs. A quarter mile farther on, they found a broken pair of wooden skis charred along the edges as if a fire had tried and failed to finish them. The searchers walked circles around those artifacts until their own footprints looked like a crop mark. No bodies, no packs, no cookware, no camera. A puzzle assembled to the edge and then missing all the centerpieces. Theories hustled to fill the gap. A bear had come into camp. The family had run. The river had taken them. The tent had shredded in a windstorm. The skis had burned because fire is how you signal for help when smoke is the only voice the sky listens to. The family had moved, all together, to higher ground. And then what? Rumor made a serviceable glue where facts wouldn't stick. The troopers did the math you don't want to see done in public. Exposure at night, water temperature, body fat, wind chill, miles of ground per day a child can walk when the adult carrying him stops being able to carry. After 3 weeks, the search officialized its own exhaustion. The Reeds wore the word missing, because language has never built a better box for grief that refuses to explain itself. Life above the Arctic Circle goes on even when a specific 4 lives do not. Posters freckled bulletin boards at gas stations. The parents' faces with that good, open look people get when a camera finds them at home. The kids' school pictures. eyes canted at that particular pride that second graders were when they haven't lost a tooth in weeks, and it's finally happened. In galleries, Marie's photos took on the charge art sometimes does when the artist can no longer add to it. Snow on Alder, a spruce cone full of sunlight. The angle of a child's boot on a cabin step. People who didn't know her looked longer because staring was the only thing left to give. The years behaved like years. They layered themselves. The pilot who had taken them and never came back. His plane went down in autumn in weather a wiser man wouldn't have argued with. He and the friend he was ferrying walked out 3 days later with frostbitten fingers and a statement for the NTSB that read like a confession to someone else's sin. The kids' school held a memorial where the principal said the word lost like a pebble in his mouth. Daniel's brother kept a box on his dresser with objects he had stolen from his own children, a pine cone, a thread spool, a coin. He didn't know why he wanted them near. He only knew that weight helps. The Brooks kept its counsels. Silence there is not absence of sound. It is a composition, wind, water, the clicks of insects. The pop of frost as it releases a rock from its grip. The place was full of things moving, none of them human. Hunters and hikers told each other what they always tell each other. Keep a clean camp. Don't argue with weather. A bear cannot take what you have not left where he can smell it. The reeds' names became the kind you speak in a low voice around a fire. Not because ghosts walk there, but because naming what a place has done can help you stay small inside it. And small sometimes survives. 7 summers after the families hung the first posters, a man named Tom Wilkins pushed deeper into a part of the country he usually left to younger knees. He had tracked a wounded moose across a shallow draw all afternoon. By evening, sleet stitched the air. Tom cut into a stand of old spruce looking for any break from the wet. That was when he saw the building. A single-room log cabin slumped into itself. The roof sagged but still mostly whole, the door hanging loose on hand-forged hinges. He knew the place wasn't on his maps. Some cabins belonged to the government, some to a man's grandfather, and some to the wilderness itself, which borrows them from whoever built them and gives them back the way the sea gives a ship back to a beach. He nudged the door with the barrel of his rifle, not because of a story, but because raccoons and foxes like a man's face. The smell met him, the cold, swallowed funk of a room that held too much too long, and he stepped back involuntarily. In the stove crouched a small drift of ash. On a shelf lay a rusted kettle and a photograph so fused to its paper that it had become an image of wood. On the floor near the far wall, 2 shapes were rolled into what might have been sleeping bags once and were not now. Tom is not the kind of man to label himself superstitious, but gravity changed directions inside him and he left. He hiked hard for 3 hours in weather that argued against him and reached his truck after midnight, turned the engine over, and washed his hands on the steering wheel to see if they would tell him what to do next. He told the troopers the next day what he'd seen. Coordinates guessed at, a description of a notch and a bend in a creek that might have been the ones he meant. Snow came early that year. The first team that went looking found country that refused to let them be specific and came back with photographs of spruce that could have been any spruce. Tom went twice more with them, and then the seasons turned, the budget cut, the file slid under a stack of other files. A man can come apart on the rack between obligation and the weather. He told himself he had done right, and told himself other things too. And both sentences were true. 5 more years. A lightning-sparked fire took a swath of black spruce 30 miles south and left behind a ribcage of snags the color of old iron. A winter brought more snow than anyone would have ordered. A spring sent more water than could be inventoried to the sea. A September laid down a hard frost the second week and a storm the third. The small animals changed their routes. And so did a trapper named Renee who had grown up in Chicken and had been walking lines since she was 9. Her father gave her the coordinates of the old roomer and told her to look if she felt like it. You might find someone's dinner, he said. Or you might find the church. He meant nothing by either except that the world is a thing you come upon. Renee found the cabin on a morning that smelled like metal. The roof had eased itself down another 4 inches since Tom's look, but the 4 walls were still holding the idea of a square. She pushed the door and stepped into a cold that felt occupied. The light through the single south window was the color photographs of ghosts try to imitate. The room's story was on the table in a soaked notebook. The paper turned to something between cloth and stone, the ink thin as old tea, the hand as familiar as a voice once you've listened long enough. July 25th. Together. Daniel says we keep our heads, and we will be fine. The children are brave. I took a picture of Sophie's hands. She called the troopers from her sat phone because sometimes the century does you favors. Stay clear. The dispatcher said, which is to say touch nothing and wait for men who will wear paper suits as if shame were contagious. Renee stayed. She left offerings of silence, as if noiselessness could count as respect. She read only enough to know what she'd done. The scene a week later looked like any other scene that has learned it will be a headline. Blue lights turning indifferent snow a wrong color, men carrying plastic crates, a line of tape to keep back no one. The remains were fragile in the way time makes everything fragile. Forensics is a discipline that sounds like a confidence, but is often only a kind of careful apology. From what they could read in the room, and from what Marie wrote in a hand that got smaller across the weeks, they wrote a story that matched most of the crooked edges. The family had made a camp on a bar near the place they thought would be the pickup. Weather had closed the sky. The pilot never found them or never flew. Nobody knows those sentences well enough to put them in order. Something, a gust, a bear's curiosity, the kind of accident that waits specifically for good people, took the tent. The skis Daniel had strapped to the packs as an insurance policy against a sudden winter became signal, and then energy. He shaved their edges down, burned them in the stove they fashioned out of a salvaged drum from a miner's dig, blackening the roof of the tent that was no longer a tent but a tarp. They moved. The diary says we follow the creek with willows. Daniel says the cabin he heard of might be there. It was there, or something like it. A building somebody had built, a shape that promised shelter. Shelter kept its promise the way an echo keeps a promise. It replays what you bring. The stove smoked. The chimney had caved years before, and someone had tried to fix it with their intention and a length of rusty pipe. The roof leaked in the pattern of old mistakes. The door did not keep wind. It remembered wind and asked for more. Still, it was a room, and rooms matter. Marie wrote, the kids slept. I told them the story about the girl who collected colors and kept them in jars for winter. Daniel laughed. He looks tired when he laughs. The entries proceed in units that weather made smaller. Daniel found a ptarmigan. We ate the best bite of our lives. Sophie drew the tracks we saw in the snow. Jacob is coughing. He asked if bears have birthdays. We boiled water. The stove is a beast we must feed. The radio will not speak to us anymore. The day she wrote, I wrote our names on the wall so this place would know us. She still put the comma in the right place. What she did not write, what no one writes when they want a story to end in triumph, was the line where the numbers stopped working. The family had food for days counted on 2 hands. The storm took days counted on 3 hands. Wood is everywhere until it is wet. Heat is easy until it leaps the small gap from hard to gone. Children are strong until they aren't, and the way they aren't is different than the way a man stops being strong. Daniel went farther each afternoon, came back smaller each evening. He cut the handle off the second pot to make it into something else that could burn. He unstitched the seam of something he loved, because fabric is energy if you're not particular about the kind. Marie salted sentences with hope because the children's eyes were the kind of thing that demand that seasoning. There is a day when she writes, in a hand that is already half winters. He says if the storm breaks, he will go toward the river. I tell him yes. The next page says nothing. The page after is back to the habit. He returned. He fell. He says the ice made trick flags for his feet. A week later, Sophie asked what we will do after. I said we will go to the library and bring home too many books. Jacob laughed. He said we will each carry a stack as high as our chins. The last full entry is simple and perfect and unbearable. Even in the cold, we hold hands. Even in the dark, we tell stories. Love does not vanish, even here. What the room remembered with its body. 2 adults near the stove and the door, 2 children together on the far side. The way mammals make a circle around the hardest thing. The kettle rusted itself into the table. The camera lay on the floor with its lens cracked where someone had stepped without looking. The film in it held the faces of the children near the day the weather turned, and one image of a low fire, and 2 pairs of hands held out to it like a prayer in a church no one had swept in years. The state took the diary and made copies for the families after arguments about records and property and the ownership of grief. Marie's brother read the last line aloud at the funeral in Fairbanks 12 years after the family had walked to the plane. Daniel's sister pressed her palm to the lacquered wood of the casket and left a print that the funeral director wiped gently away because it is his job to sternly edit reality. The pastor said mercy in a voice that tried not to take sides against the wilderness. Someone sang in a pitch that made a room that would have fallen apart without music fall together. They buried the 4 in a rectangle that felt indecently small for the amount of attention the spot will always require. If the story ended there, it would be as complete as most stories get. But myths acquire complications the way driftwood acquires nails. The man who found the cabin the first time and could not find it again wore his shame in public to earn the right to remove it in private. The trapper who found it the second time left a small stone on the stump when the state dismantled the cabin. Not because the dead need houses, but because the living need to imagine that raw material can be turned back into something other than itself. A trooper kept a photocopy of a single diary page in his wallet for 2 years, then took it out because the feeling he had every time he saw it did not improve the lives of the people he served. The map in the office where the file is kept has a pin that looks like all the other pins until you put your finger on it, and then it feels hotter than the rest. 5 years after the funeral, a ranger flew a winter patrol along a line that nobody else bothers with and saw, for 20 seconds, a set of spruce arranged in a way that hinted at order. Snowholds shaped the way a good memory does. imprecise but resistant to erasure. He landed the Super Cub where he could and skied in a mile and found nothing but a feeling that he was walking over a paragraph the place had decided to redact. He told no one because no one needed that feeling, and because some knowledge improves nothing by being shared. Theories did not die when the bodies did. Some men in bars said the cabin had once been a poacher's shack, and the man had left it unsafe because who else should it be safe for? Other men said a bear will come through any door that isn't a wall, and sometimes through a wall that isn't a door, and the people inside had fought something besides weather. The diary doesn't give a monster permission to enter, which is to say it notices only the ones the writer chose to allow onto the page. A few people imply Daniel was reckless, but most of them haven't read what Marie wrote about numbers and caution and turning back from a view because a cloud said don't. The kindest version is the one that can't be used to wound the dead. A late storm, a plane delayed by weather it was wise not to argue with, a family that did everything right for longer than most would, a room that kept them together, a notebook that kept them alive to us. The state burned the cabin down after the recovery, not because of evidence, but because structures like that called to fools. The boards went up like paper, the nails skated briefly in red, and then the place took a breath and went silent as if nothing had ever borrowed time there. Snow later covered what was left, and then the shrubs did, and this is how the North apologizes to itself for our interruptions. In town, in a small museum that does not charge admission because nobody there has figured out how to charge for sorrow, one of Marie's cameras sits in a glass case. The cracked lens faces a window. People look at it, and then at the photo hung nearby of the kids on the gravel bar with the plane behind them, and then they look down because looking up is too much like asking. The label is short and careful. It does not name a villain. It names a place and 4 people and 2 dates, and the word found as if that were kindness, and maybe it is. If you drive north in July and stop where Daniel would have stopped to check the map against the world, you will see willow leaves the size of your hand and a sky that tells you nothing you can use. If you sleep by the river, you will hear it talk about distances in a grammar that doesn't have numbers. If you walk up to high ground and look out, you will feel small in a way that might heal something in you or might break it, depending on what you brought with you to fix. And if you think of the 4 reads, you will think of the last sentence Marie wrote and the way love behaves when the math stops working. You might even say that sentence out loud. No one will hear you but the creatures and the weather and the stone, and none of those will argue. They set out on a family hike in Alaska. The plane dropped them like a pin in a world too large for pins. The weather turned as simply as a page. The searchers found what storms leave behind when they're done testing a person's inventory. 7 summers later, a man found a cabin and could not keep it. 5 after that, a woman found it the way the world eventually hands back what it can bear. In the end, what made it home to the living were 4 bodies, a notebook, and a sentence that will not stop ringing. Love does not vanish, even here.